Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode on Learn React. In this episode, we'll take a look in depth at React lifecycle methods. To begin with, I have set up a simple component with some initial craft methods, so we don't need to go over them. So what I've set up is initial state, which we have discussed previously, sets the state of an object. Get default props, which sets default properties for an object. Render, which we saw previously, which is used for rendering and is required by a component. Toggle state, which is going to just update the state of the method. Based on the initial status, it is going to just toggle this particular status. Here I'm using a new method for on-click handling, and I'm specifying what to run, like which method, which function to run when this component is clicked. We'll take a look at in detail about event handlers in some of our later episodes. To start with, let's take a look at what this does. So in this file, first thing what it is doing is it is printing start, and then when it is rendering the component, it is going to log render. So the first thing that we want to take a look at is component will mount. So this method is going to get called whenever React component is going to be mounted. This will happen when we are saying render component, and this component is getting mounted on document.body. So we'll be printing mount, and it will say start component will mount and render. So this method is useful for doing some setup tasks before a particular component is going to be rendered. The next method is component did mount. Again, this method will be called after a component is mounted. So what is happening is it is going to call start component will mount, render for the first time, and then call component did mount. Right now, to go back, we have set up the on-click handler. Whenever I'm going to click, it is going to call the render method again without calling the component will mount or did mount, because these are already mounted. The next method is component will receive props. So this method is going to be called whenever new properties are made available to component. As previously discussed, the get default props is going to set and cache these values which are not mutable, the default props. On the first rendering, when this component is going to be rendered, that is react.render component, these values are going to be cached. When we are going to re-render or mount another method, it is going to call the component will receive props, since it already has initial properties, and then it is going to receive new properties on top of that default properties. So remember that the first time a component is being rendered, you won't be seeing component will receive props. So let's take a look at how that will happen. So if you take a look, it is calling start component will mount render, and then after it has mounted, it is going to call component will receive props, since it already has initial properties cached globally for that component, and then it is receiving new properties which we can see over here. So let's change this back. The next method is component will mount, will update. Oh, sorry, should component update. So this method is going to be called just before the render method. So for the initial render, this won't be called, but for the later render methods, so let's just run this. So the initial rendering, this method won't be called, but whenever we are trying to re-render this, it is going to be invoked. Now in component should component update, it is receiving next props, and next state, and it expects us to return true or false. So what happens is, if I'm going to click hello, it will check the return value from should component update, and based on whether it is true or false, it will either re-render this method or not. So if I say this is false and I click on it, you see it is coming to should component update, but render is not being printed. I'll change this back to true again. The next method that we want to see is component will update. So as you can see, whenever this component is going to be re-rendered, it is going to call the component will update. So whenever we are trying to re-update a particular component, we can do different DOM manipulations or some other work which is required before we want to redisplay a component. Another similar method is component did update, which is going to be called just after the component is updated. The last method that we want to take a look at is component will unmount. So this method is going to be called whenever a component is going to be unmounted. This can happen as an example. We can take a look at this, wherein what we are doing is we are calling react.unmount component at node, and we are passing the node. So if I call unmount for this particular component, it will print component will unmount and then return true or false from react unmount component at node. By using this, that is component will unmount, we can clean up some objects which we have created, or in cases like in the previous video we saw creating a clock tick where we use set interval, so we can clear those intervals and do some cleanup jobs. So that's it for React lifecycle methods. Thank you for watching.